Hello there. Thank you for joining me today. Before I get started, I want to talk briefly about the Congo and Ebola, because the Congo gives us an example of the argument made by Walter Rodney, the man I will be talking about today. A country can export enormous wealth while its population becomes poorer rather than richer. The wealth leaving a country and the poverty inside it aren't necessarily contradictions. Under an economic structure, they can occur together. Currently, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there is a serious trust problem between the communities and the healthcare system. I was watching an interview about the Ebola breakout that's going on now, and an infectious disease expert said that one of the biggest problems was that the people in the affected area did not trust the healthcare system or healthcare workers and were afraid of how they would be treated. And it goes beyond simple reluctance to seek medical care. She described treatment centers being burned, patients fleeing because centers were being attacked, people being shot, and infected people being treated outside healthcare facilities because they were afraid to go into them. The number that really jumps out is this. A WHO regional director said 60 to 70% of the people dying were dying at home rather than in treatment centers. Now consider where this is happening. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the most extraordinarily resource-rich countries in Africa and in the world. I'll repeat it in case you didn't hear me. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the most extraordinarily resource-rich countries in Africa and in the world. You will repeatedly see an estimate of approximately $24 trillion in untapped mineral resources. The country contains enormous deposits of cobalt, copper, coltan, and other strategically important minerals used throughout the modern global economy. Yet large numbers of Congolese remain poor or displaced, and many see very little benefit from the enormous natural wealth beneath their own country. Armed groups, neighboring states, Congolese elites, foreign companies, and international commodity chains have all participated at different times in extracting value from these resources. So you have an extraordinary contradiction. People can be displaced from some of the richest land on earth while the resources beneath the land continue moving into the international economy. The people move out, the minerals move out, and much of the wealth generated elsewhere never returns to the communities from which it came. That brings me to Walter Rodney. Rodney spent much of his life trying to explain how a place could be enormously rich in resources while the people living there remained poor. And he argued that this wasn't simply an accident or a failure of Africa to develop. To understand his argument, we have to go back to colonialism and ask what happened to Africa's wealth after independence. And we're going to go there today. How did I ever find Walter Rodney? Well, before researching the assassination of the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, I had never heard of Walter Rodney. That surprised me, especially after all the shows I have done about Africa. Walter Rodney spent the 1960s and the 1970s arguing that colonialism had not simply ended when African countries gained their independence. The flags changed, the governments changed, but the extraction of Africa's wealth and the enormous influence of outside economic powers continued. On June the 13th, 1980, Walter Rodney was murdered by a car bomb in Guyana. Within 5 to 10 years of his death, many of the issues Rodney had spent his life warning about were becoming major international concerns. By the 1990s, Africa's debt, structural adjustment, foreign control, and continuing economic dependency were being widely debated in academic and developmental circles. Rodney had been talking about these problems decades earlier. He argued that political independence did not necessarily mean economic independence. And less than a decade after he was killed or murdered, much of what he had been describing was becoming impossible to ignore. Walter Rodney was a Guyanese historian, scholar, political activist, and one of the most important thinkers to emerge from the Caribbean in the 20th century. He studied and taught in the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe, and became internationally known for his work on colonialism, slavery, and the economic exploitation of Africa. His best-known book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, published in 1972, challenged the conventional story of Africa's poverty by examining the enormous wealth and resource extracted from the continent during centuries of slavery and European colonial rule. But Rodney wasn't simply an academic writing from a university office. He became politically active, spoke directly to workers and ordinary people, and eventually returned to Guyana, where he became one of the country's most important opposition figures. Walter Rodney's death in 1980 remains one of the most debated political assassinations in Caribbean history. At the time, Guyana was led by Forbes Burnham, Burnham, who had served first as prime minister and later became the country's executive president. By 1980, Burnham had consolidated power, and Walter Rodney had emerged as one of his most prominent political opponents. The case raises difficult questions about the actions of the Guyanese government under Burman's leadership, and by extension, the British and American governments during the Cold War era. The commission also found that Burnham was part of the conspiracy surrounding Rodney's death, although it did not identify direct evidence that he personally ordered the assassination. Walter Rodney deserves to be remembered not simply for how he died, but for how he lived, what he taught, and the questions he was willing to ask. Today, I want to share his story. But before Walter Rodney became an internationally recognized scholar and political activist, he was a young history student at the University College of the West Indies. It was there, in December 1960, that he met Patricia, the woman he would become his wife, raise their family with him, and stand beside him throughout the challenges that lay ahead. Let's talk a little bit about car bombings and some of the most recent examples. The most famous examples of car bombings are from Sicily. So I started wondering, why did they blow Walter Rodney up in a car bomb? Well, because they have a past doing car bombs. First case out of Sicily was Giovanni Falcone. On May the 23rd, 1992, the Sicilian mafia detonated about 500 kilograms, over 1,000 pounds, of explosives buried beneath the highway near Capaci. As Falcone's convoy passed, Falcone, his wife, and 3 bodyguards were killed. There was another case, Paolo Borsellino, less than 2 months later, on July the 19th, 1992, a car packed with explosives was detonated outside his mother's apartment in Palermo, killing Borsellino and 5 police officers. These attacks were carried out by the Cosa Nostra, Cosa-Nostra, during what became known as a campaign against the Italian state. In other countries, in Italy, mafia organizations have used car bombs against judges, prosecutors, police officers, politicians, and rival criminals. In Mexico, drug cartels have occasionally used vehicle bombs, though this has been much less common than shootings or ambushes. In the United States, traditional American mafia families have generally preferred targeted shootings, disappearances, and beatings over car bombings. Explosives have been used on occasion, but they have never been the hallmark of the American mafia. One reason is practical. A car bomb creates a large blast, attracts intense media attention, and greatly increases law enforcement pressure. It also risks killing bystanders, which can provoke a stronger government response. Criminal organizations want to quietly eliminate a rival and often prefer methods that are more controlled. So in 1980, Walter Rodney is killed after activating what he believed was a secure walkie-talkie. In 2018, mail bombs disguised as ordinary packages are sent to several prominent public figures in the United States. 2024, thousands of pagers explode across Lebanon after being secretly modified with explosives. It makes me kind of wonder, did they learn from killing Rodney what they did later in Lebanon? I don't know. One day later, hundreds of walkie-talkies explode in Lebanon. These cases remind us that weapons are not always obvious. And it also reminds me that we're looking at some one-trick ponies, right? I think they learned about these walkie-talkies when they got rid of Walter Rodney, when they murdered him. And we also have political car bombings. Before looking at Rodney's life, it's worth stepping back and looking at the history of political bombings involving vehicles. Rodney's assassination belongs to a much larger pattern. The first one I could find was in 1920, and this was in the United States. There was a bombing on Wall Street. A horse-drawn wagon loaded with explosives detonated outside the J.P. Morgan building in New York City. 38 people were killed. Although it wasn't an automobile, it remains one of the earliest major examples of a vehicle being used as a bomb. And then in 1942, there was Reinhard Heydrich, was one of the most powerful leaders in Nazi Germany and a principal architect of the Holocaust. Heydrich was mortally wounded when Czech and Slovak resistance fighters attacked his open-top car with a specially modified grenade in Prague. Although it was not a car bomb, it became one of history's best-known explosive attacks on a moving vehicle. So in the 1950s to the 1960s, vehicle bombs began appearing more frequently in conflicts throughout the Middle East. The technique continued to evolve and became increasingly common in political violence. 1962, there was a journalist from Germany that was attempted bombing. 1963, Cyprus. Late 1960s in Northern Ireland, the Irish Republic Army increasingly adopted vehicle bombs. This marked the period of what most historians consider the modern era of organized car bomb terrorism, and that would be the late 1960s. 1972, there was Bloody Friday. The IRA detonated 22 bombs across Belfast, while placed many inside vehicles. 1973, Luis Canedo Blanco. Canedo Blanco was a Spanish admiral, longtime associate of Francisco Franco, and Prime Minister of Spain. On December 20th, 1973, the Basque separatist group ETA detonated a massive explosive charge beneath a Madrid street as his official car passed overhead. The explosion launched the vehicle over a nearby building, making it one of the most famous political bombings in modern history. 1976, Orlando Letelier. After Augusto Pinochet seized power in Chile, Letelier became one of the dictatorship's most outspoken critics while living in exile in the United States. On September 21, 1976, a bomb exploded beneath his car in Washington, D.C., killing Letelier and his colleague, Ronnie Matif. It remains one of the most notorious acts of political assassination ever carried out on American soil. 1979, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten was killed when the IRA bombed his fishing boat. Although it was not a vehicle bombing involving an automobile, it formed part of the broader IRA's bombing campaign. I always wondered, did they blow him up because of what he was doing to the boys, that he was harming the ones he was raping? Could be. 1980, Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney was killed in Georgetown, Guyana, when an explosive device concealed inside what appeared to be a communications device detonated while he sat inside his car with his brother. His brother survived. Rodney did not. A later commission of inquiry concluded that he had been assassinated and implicated state actors. As you'll see, Rodney's death was different from many of these attacks. The explosive wasn't hidden beneath a vehicle or planted alongside a road. Instead, the weapon itself had been disguised as a communication device and carried into the car by the victim himself. So who was Walter Rodney? Walter Anthony Rodney was born in Georgetown, British Guiana in 1942. He grew up in a working-class family. From an early age, he excelled at school, earning scholarships that eventually took him overseas. Unlike many historians, Rodney never believed history should remain inside universities. He believed scholarship should be understandable to ordinary people and useful to ordinary people. By 1960, Rodney entered the University of the West Indies, where he studied history during a period of enormous political change. Across Africa and the Caribbean, colonies were becoming independent. New nations were emerging, but one question kept resurfacing. Did political independence automatically bring economic freedom? That question became the defining theme of Rodney's career. Did political independence automatically bring economic freedom? In 1963, he graduated with first-class honors in history, quickly establishing himself as one of the Caribbean's brightest young scholars. Just 3 years later, at the age of 24, he earned a PhD in African history from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Rather than focusing on kings, battles, and governments, Rodney became interested in the long-term economic relationship between Europe and Africa. Most historians asked a familiar question: why is Africa poor? Rodney asked a different one: who benefited while Africa became poor? That shift in perspective would define the rest of his career. After completing his doctorate, Rodney traveled and taught in Tanzania during one of the most optimistic periods of post-colonial African history. Many newly independent nations believed they were entering a new era. Political independence had finally been achieved, but Rodney questioned whether independence alone would solve the deeper economic problems inherited from colonial rule. He admired the optimism, but he argued that replacing colonial governments did not automatically dismantle the economic systems those governments had created. During these years, Rodney's reputation grew rapidly. He was becoming much more than a university professor. He was a historian, a teacher, a public speaker, a political organizer, a public intellectual. Unlike many academics, Rodney deliberately spoke not only to scholars, but also to workers, students, and community organizations. He believed history belonged to everyone, not just universities. That approach made him enormously influential and increasingly confrontational. In 1968, the Jamaican government banned Rodney from entering the country. Officials believed his political activities were encouraging unrest. That decision sparked widespread demonstrations that became known as the Walter Rodney riots. Almost overnight, Rodney ceased to be simply an academic historian. He had become an international political figure. Governments were no longer merely criticizing his ideas, Some had begun to view his influence as a political threat. So in 1972, Rodney published the book that would define his career, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. More than 50 years later, it remains one of the most influential books ever written on African history. Rodney's argument was both simple and provocative. For generations, the dominant explanation for Africa's poverty emphasized internal problems, lack of modernization, tribal divisions, poor governance, or failures that occurred after independence. Rodney argued that this explanation ignored centuries of history. His position was that Africa was not simply underdeveloped. It had been actively underdeveloped through the combined efforts and effects of the Atlantic slave trade, European colonialism, unequal trade relationships, and the systematic extraction of labor and natural resources. In Rodney's view, Europe's economic development and Africa's underdevelopment were connected parts of the same historical process. Whether one agrees with all of his conclusions or not, this represented a significant shift in how many scholars approach African history. Rather than treating poverty as a natural condition or an internal failure, Rodney argued that it was a result of historical relationships stretching back hundreds of years. And why? Why was his book so different? Well, Rodney was not the first scholar to criticize colonialism. What made his work distinctive was the way he brought several ideas together into a single, understandable argument. He argued that European colonial powers played a central role in creating unequal economic relationships. He also argued that after independence, some African political and economic elites continued to benefit from those same unequal systems rather than dismantling them. Just as importantly, Rodney wrote in language that ordinary readers could understand. Many academic books remain inside universities. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was Rodney's book, escaped the classroom. It was read by students, activists, political organizers, teachers, and ordinary readers throughout Africa and the Caribbean. That accessibility greatly expanded both Rodney's influence and the criticism directed toward him. Through the 1970s, Rodney became internationally known. His work spread through African universities, Caribbean intellectual circles, Pan-African organizations, developmental studies, and political movements around the world. Ironically, while his ideas became highly influential, Rodney himself remained relatively unknown to much of the general public. Even today, many people are familiar with arguments that were influenced by Rodney without realizing where those ideas came from. Rodney's work generated strong reaction from supporters and critics alike. Supporters argued that he fundamentally changed the study of African history by placing slavery, colonialism, and global trade at the center of the discussion. Critics argued that his interpretations relied too heavily on Marxist analysis and did not give enough attention to internal political, economic, and social developments within African nations after independence. Some historians believed he placed too much responsibility on European colonial powers. Others argued that post-colonial governments also bore significant responsibility for many of the continent's later challenges. These same debates continue today. But regardless of where historians fall within that debate, few dispute Rodney's influence. His book forced scholars to ask new questions. It challenged long-established assumptions, and it helped reshape the study of African economic history. He believed scholarship should not simply describe injustice, but help ordinary people understand it. For supporters, that made him an engaged public intellectual. For critics, it blurred the line between scholarship and political activism. Either way, it made Walter Rodney one of the most important and most controversial historians of the 20th century. By the late 1970s, Rodney had become one of the best-known historians in Africa and the Caribbean, but he wasn't content to remain overseas. He returned to Guyana because he believed the ideas he wrote about should be applied at home. Rodney argued that independence alone was not enough if political and economic power remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite. He openly criticized corruption, authoritarianism, and inequality, regardless of who held power. His growing popularity also made him an increasingly controversial figure within Guyana's political establishment. Rodney believed history was not simply about understanding the past. He believed it should help people understand the society they were living in. That conviction placed him on a collision course with powerful interests. On the evening of June 13, 1980, Rodney met Gregory Smith, a sergeant in the Guyana Defense Force with electronics expertise. Smith had provided Rodney with what appeared to be a walkie-talkie or communications device. Rodney believed it would allow him to communicate more securely while avoiding government surveillance. Later that evening, Rodney and his brother Daniel drove near the Georgetown prison, where Rodney had been instructed to test the device. Donald, his brother, was driving. Rodney sat in the front passenger seat. When Rodney switched on the device, it exploded instantly. Walter Rodney was killed immediately. Donald Rodney survived with serious injuries. Rodney was only 38 years old. So what happened? For years, the official explanation was that Rodney had accidentally detonated a bomb intended for someone else. Many people challenged that account almost immediately. Over the following decades, new evidence emerged. A commission of inquiry established by the government of Guyana later concluded that Rodney had been assassinated using a booby-trapped communication device and found that Gregory Smith had acted with the involvement of state agencies operating under the government of Forbes Burnham. Smith left Guyana shortly after the explosion and lived for many years under an assumed identity before his death. Although debate continues over some details surrounding the case, the commission rejected the earlier explanation that Rodney had accidentally blown himself up. And I'd like to share some final thoughts. Walter Rodney wrote one of the 20th century's most influential books about Africa. Yet outside academic, African, and Caribbean circles, many people have never heard his name. Whether history ultimately judges all of his conclusions to be correct or not, there is little doubt that he changed the entire conversation. He asked questions that historians still debate today. He challenged assumptions that many people had accepted without question. After his life ended, before he had the opportunity to continue that work. Perhaps that's why I wanted to introduce him today, not because everyone has to agree with Walter Rodney, but because people should know who he was. And in closing, Walter Rodney was only 38 years old. He left behind his wife, Patricia, and 3 children. Beyond the politics and the headlines, a husband and father never came home that night. Before I go, I'd like to ask one small favor. If Walter Rodney's story meant something to you today, I hope you'll take a few minutes to learn more about the Walter Rodney Foundation and the work it continues to do today. If you're able to support it with a donation, that's wonderful. If not, simply share Rodney's work with someone you know. By the time Walter Rodney was murdered in 1980, at the age of just 38 years old, he had spent well over a decade living under government surveillance. Much of his adult life unfolded with intelligence agencies monitoring his lectures, his travels, his political activities, and even the people he met. Imagine trying to teach, write, raise a family, and change the world while living under that kind of pressure year after year. Walter's wife, Patricia, did far more than preserve his memory. After Walter's assassination, she raised all three children as a single parent, remained in the Caribbean, built her own career in public health, and later helped found the Walter Rodney Foundation. From 1974 until Walter's death in 1980, she described the family as living under constant surveillance with police searches, bomb threats, periods in safe houses, and even the children affected by the political pressure. It really underscores how young the family was. Walter was killed at 38. Patricia was still a young mother, and their three children were all still minors. Walter Rodney was born on March the 23rd, 1942. Had he lived, he would be 84 years old today. Be safe out there, and goodbye for now.